A surname can function as a document. It can preserve evidence of a specific man in a specific system at a specific historical moment, more reliably in some cases than the parish register that recorded his burial. These 10 names were formed during the Crusades, assigned to men who performed roles, took vows, joined institutions, or returned from places the church had told them to reach. They rank by what each name still proves, by documentary depth, by the scale of the history compressed inside a single word, and by how much has been forgotten by the people carrying it. The forgetting is part of the record. Most people read a surname as a family identifier, a label passed down through generations, chosen by no one alive today, and carrying nothing except the sound of the name itself. That reading is wrong. The surnames on this list are administrative records. They were created by clerks, priests, and tax collectors working in the 12th and 13th centuries to identify men who had done something that separated them from every other person in their community. The Crusades moved hundreds of thousands of people across the known world. They pressed that movement into the language of ordinary men and women. These 10 names are what that pressure left behind. They rank by how directly and how durably each one encodes its crusading origin, measured by documentary survival, by the number of living people still carrying the evidence, by the depth of the institutional or personal history the name contains, and by the weight of what it actually proves about the man who first wore it. The list moves from names that gesture toward the Crusades to names that are, in every meaningful sense, signed confessions. One name at the end of this list is not a metaphor and not an association. It is a literal record of a vow, translated into a word, carried forward across 8 centuries without interruption. The list grows heavier as it descends. Number 10. The name pilgrim looks like a devotional word. It is, in fact, a travel record pressed into a family name. The surname appears across England and northern France from the 11th through the 13th centuries, with its heaviest concentrations in Lincolnshire, Norfolk, and the West Riding of Yorkshire. It derives from the Latin peregrinus, one who travels through foreign lands, which entered Middle English as pilgrim and was applied as a byname to men who had undertaken the journey to Jerusalem, Rome, or Santiago de Compostela. In the context of the Crusades, the connection is more specific than it first appears. The First Crusade of 1096 was formally designated in canon law as a peregrinatio armata, an armed pilgrimage, and its participants were explicitly classified as pilgrims, entitled to the same spiritual privileges and legal protections as unarmed devotional travelers. The byname became hereditary when sons continued to be identified by their father's defining journey. The journey that had changed one man's legal and spiritual status became the word that named his children. The Curia Regis rolls of 1219 record a Wilhelmus pilgrim in Lincolnshire. English subsidy rolls carry the name as early as 1198. Historians estimate the name was held by between 200 and 400 English households by the mid-13th century. Current electoral register data shows approximately 1,800 people bearing the surname Pilgrim in England and Wales today. The Lincolnshire Archives in Lincoln holds poll tax returns from 1377 listing 3 separate Pilgrim households within a single parish, the same county where the name first surfaces in medieval administrative records, the same geography 8 centuries compressed into a filing cabinet in a reading room. Pilgrim ranks at number 10 because it is the most legible entry on this list. The connection between the name and the Crusades is intuitive once stated. That legibility is also a limitation. Pilgrimage was a broader category than crusading, and not every man who carried this byname necessarily took the cross. The name gestures toward the Crusades without being confined to them. The detail most people do not know concerns a legal distinction buried inside the terminology. Under the Assize of the Cross, issued in 1188, men who took the crusading vow were formally exempted from certain civil debts for the duration of their absence, and they were designated in chancery documents not simply as pilgrims, but as peregrinus crucisignatus, the pilgrim signed with the cross. This distinguished the crusading pilgrim from the ordinary devotional traveler in every administrative record that touched him. Some pilgrim surnames may descend specifically from men who held this precise legal status. Not pilgrims in the general sense, but men whose pilgrimage was also an enrollment. The name pilgrim appears on current electoral rolls in Lincolnshire and Norfolk. The Lincolnshire Archives holds the relevant poll tax membranes, a map, showing 12th century pilgrimage routes from the northern English counties to the ports of embarkation sites in the British Library collections in London, and the routes it traces pass through the same parishes where the pilgrim name first appears in the subsidy rolls. Most people who live in those parishes today do not know this. The name has been there longer than the current buildings. The name at number 9 carries a less obvious connection, a word so altered by 8 centuries of English phonology that most people who bear it have no idea it once described a man who wore a cross on his coat. Number 9, most people who hear the name Crusoe think of a fictional castaway. The name itself is older than the novel by several centuries, and it has nothing to do with islands. The surname Crusoe, along with its variant forms Croisé, Croiser, and Cruiser, derives from the Old French croisier, meaning one who has taken the cross, from la croix. It was the standard term in Anglo-Norman administrative French for a man formally enrolled in a crusading expedition. In northern England, where Anglo-Norman administrative language overlaid a substrate of Norse and Old English, the word was anglicized quickly, producing phonetic corruptions that compressed the sound across generations. Croisier became Croiser, Croiser became Cruiser, and Cruiser, by increments no single clerk recorded, became Crusoe. The byname was not self-applied, it was assigned by clerks who recorded men, at the moment they swore the crusading vow, a legal and sacramental act witnessed by a priest, entered into ecclesiastical records and attached to the man's identity from that point forward. The earliest surviving variant appears in the pipe rolls of Henry II, dated 1165, where a Rogerus le Croisier is recorded in connection with a northern English landholding. The relevant entry sits on membrane 14 of the Durham account, held at the National Archives in Kew, legible to any trained paleographer who requests it from the reading room. The name appears not as an honorific, but in a list of men assessed for a local levy, identified by their crusading status as the basis for an exemption from standard obligation. The crusading vow had legal weight. The clerk recorded it because it changed what the man owed. Daniel Defoe, writing in 1719, almost certainly drew the name Robinson Crusoe from this surviving English surname. Historians of the novel have noted that the name's archaic quality suggests deliberate archaism rather than invention, a writer reaching for something that sounded old and remote, finding a word that was in fact a 7-century-old administrative designation. The fiction absorbed the history without knowing it was there. Fewer than 100 households carry any Crusoe variant in England and Wales today. It is among the rarest surviving Crusade-derived names in the country. The pipe roll membrane where the name first appears is in the National Archives, available for consultation. The name Rogerus le Croisier is written there in a hand that shows no particular emphasis, no awareness that this entry would outlast the man, the expedition, and the language in which it was recorded. Number 8 carries the enemy inside the name itself, a word taken from the Arabic-speaking world and worn for centuries by English families who may never have understood what they were holding. Number 8. The surname Saracen does not describe a crusader. It describes who the crusader fought, or met, or brought back across the sea, and English families have carried that description ever since. The name appears in English and Northern French records from the 12th through the 14th centuries, concentrated most heavily in Kent, Essex, and London, the southern and eastern counties where returning crusaders first made landfall, and where the administrative machinery of crusading recruitment was most active. Saracen was the standard medieval Latin and Anglo-Norman term for Muslim inhabitants of the Holy Land, North Africa, and Iberia. It derived ultimately from the Greek Sarakenoi, passed through Arabic, and entered Western European administrative language through the documents crusading expeditions generated, muster lists, prisoner records, provisioning accounts, and the correspondence of crusading lords with the papal curia. The surname was applied to several distinct categories of person. Some bearers were men of apparent Middle Eastern or North African origin living in England. Freed captives brought back by returning crusaders, converted prisoners settled by their captors on English estates, merchants and diplomats whose presence in English port towns was a direct consequence of crusading-era contact. Others were the sons of mixed heritage unions formed in the Crusader states, men who crossed the sea twice, once in the womb, once as settlers. The name was also applied as a nickname to English-born men with dark complexions or features perceived as foreign. That last usage is itself a document, not of any individual's origin, but of how the Crusades changed what English people saw when they looked at a stranger, and what category they reached for when they needed to name the difference. A Robertus Saracenus appears in the Domesday Book of 1086, making this one of the earliest post-conquest bynames with a clear crusading era etymology. The application predates the First Crusade and most likely refers to a man of Sicilian Norman origin. The Norman world had maintained contact with Islamic culture in Sicily for a generation before Urban II preached at Clermont, and men from that world moved freely through the Norman aristocracy of England. The heraldic records are more pointed. The Saracen's head, a turbaned face rendered in profile, sometimes bearded, sometimes with a broken lance behind it, appears as a charge on English noble arms from the 13th century onward. It was not decorative, it was commemorative. It announced in the visual language of heraldry that the family bearing it had met Muslim forces in the field and considered that encounter worth remembering on their shield for every generation that followed. The Herald's College in London holds painted vellum copies of the 13th century heraldic rolls. At least 12 English noble families recorded in those rolls bear the Saracen's head charge. The vellum is worn at the edges, but the colors hold. Black turban, gold face, the particular stillness of a profile that has been stared at across 8 centuries without moving. Historians estimate several hundred English households carried the surname by the late 13th century. Fewer than 300 bearers appear on current electoral registers in England and Wales. The name is densest in Kent, the same county through which most crusading expeditions departed from English soil, and where the administrative records of embarkation were maintained by the same ecclesiastical infrastructure that had organized the recruitment. Saracen ranks above Crusoe because its historical reach is wider and its meaning more complex. It documents not simply the act of crusading, but the collision the Crusades produced, cultural, biological, administrative, and it opens a category the earlier entries on this list do not touch, names that encode the encounter rather than the enlistment. It ranks below the entries that follow it because it can describe several different kinds of person, not all of them crusaders in the strict sense, and the ambiguity that makes it historically rich also makes it less precise as a document. Number 7. The name Crossman looks like it might describe a man who carved crosses or sold them at market or lived at the junction of 2 roads. It describes none of these things. Yorkshire and Lincolnshire hold the densest early records of the name. It appears in administrative documents from the late 12th century onward, and it is most fully documented in the poll tax returns of 1379, the systematic levy imposed across England to fund military campaigns, and one of the most detailed surviving records of ordinary English surnames at the moment they were becoming fixed. Crossman is a direct English translation of the crusading designation. It named a man of the cross, someone who had formally enrolled in a crusading expedition by sewing a cloth cross to the outer surface of his tunic, the physical act that transformed a private religious intention into a public, legally binding vow. The act of taking the cross was sacramental and carried legal weight. A man who sewed the cross and subsequently abandoned the expedition without papal dispensation was subject to ecclesiastical censure and could be summoned before church courts. The byname recorded this status in the language of the men around him. Where Crusoe and Pilgrim arrived through Latin and Anglo-Norman French administrative vocabulary, the language of clerks who wrote in the registers of great lords, Crossman is native English. It was applied by English-speaking parish clerks to English-speaking men in communities where the Norman French croisier had not embedded itself, communities where the cross on the coat was simply called what it was, and the man who wore it was named for it in the same plain terms. The poll tax returns of 1379, held at the National Archives in Kew, list a Johannes Crossman in the West, riding of Yorkshire, assessed at 4 pence, the standard levy for a common laborer, which places him without ambiguity in the working population of the county, rather than its landholding class. The English Surnames Project at the University of Leicester, conducting systematic analysis of surname distributions across medieval records, has identified the name in 7 separate Yorkshire parishes between 1300 and 1400. Approximately 2,600 people carry the surname Crossman in England and Wales today, making it the most widely distributed purely English crusading-derived surname on this list. The cross itself, the physical object the byname commemorates, was color-coded. In the Third Crusade of 1189 to 1192, English crusaders wore white, French crusaders wore red, Flemish crusaders wore green. The color distinguished national contingent from national contingent in the visual chaos of a crusading host. A man named Crossman in a Yorkshire poll-tax membrane was almost certainly descended from someone who wore white linen on his back and was identified by that cloth in every record his community kept of him. The poll-tax membrane for the West Riding is catalogued at Kew and available for consultation. The membrane itself is brown at the edges, the ink still legible at the center of each line. Johannes Crossman's entry is 4 words. It has been there for 646 years. Number 6 belongs to an institution rather than an individual, an order whose name became a surname when the order itself was destroyed, its leadership burned, and its assets distributed to its rivals by the hand of a pope who owed a favor to a king. Number 6. The surname Templar is what survived after the institution that produced it was abolished by papal decree, its Grand Master burned alive on an island in the Seine, and its property in England transferred by chancery instrument to an order that had not built it and would not maintain it. The Order of the Temple was founded in Jerusalem in 1119 by Hugues de Payens and a small group of knights who offered their swords to protect pilgrims traveling the road between the coast and the Holy City. They were given quarters in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which the Crusaders had designated as the Temple of Solomon, and the name followed from the building. Within a decade, the order had papal recognition. Within a generation, it held preceptories from Scotland to Cyprus, operated a financial network that functioned as a proto-banking system across Christendom, and employed thousands of men, knights, sergeants, priests, and lay workers in the management of its estates. Men who served the order in agricultural, administrative, or military capacities were identified in local records as Templarius, or in Middle English, simply as Templar, the byname attached to servants, to tenants of Templar estates, to lay brothers who plowed the order's fields and maintained its mill races and kept the accounts of its granges. When the order fell, those men remained. The estates changed hands, the names did not. The English Templar Preceptory at Temple Brewer in Lincolnshire was established approximately 1150 on several thousand acres of the Lincolnshire limestone heath. The preceptory employed hundreds of lay workers across its agricultural operations. Partial administrative records from Temple Brewer survive at the Lincolnshire Archives in Lincoln, and they list Templari among the tenant population. Men identified not by craft or landholding, but by their relationship to the order that owned the ground they worked. Philip IV of France moved against the Templars in October 1307, arresting hundreds of brothers in a single coordinated action and extracting confessions of heresy and sodomy under interrogation. The charges are regarded by most modern historians as politically fabricated. Philip needed money. The Templars had it. The papal bull Vox in Excelso, issued by Clement V at the Council of Vienne in 1312, formally dissolved the order. In England, the suppression generated chancery records documenting the transfer of 41 preceptories to the Knights Hospitaller. The men who had worked those preceptories were not transferred. They were simply released into a landscape that no longer contained the institution that had named them. Approximately 800 people carry the surname Templar in England and Wales today. The round tower of Temple Brewer Preceptory stands in a Lincolnshire field between Sleaford and Lincoln. It is Grade 1 listed. The road passes close enough that a driver would see it if they knew to look. Most do not know to look. The village nearby is still called Temple Brewer. The name above the road sign records an institution dissolved 712 years ago, on the authority of a pope acting at the request of a French king who died 4 years later having spent the money. The tower stands in open ground. There is no heritage marker at the base explaining what the word temple means or what happened to the men who worked the fields around it or where their names went. If this is the kind of history that stays with you, names that are actually documents, institutions whose destruction pressed itself into the language of ordinary people, subscribe to Origin's archive. Every list goes this deep. The next 4 entries go deeper still. Number 5. The surname Palfreyman does not sound like a war name. It carries no obvious martial weight, no echo of siege or slaughter. It is, in fact, one of the most precise occupational records of what it actually took to move a crusading army across 3,000 miles of hostile terrain. And it has been sitting in Yorkshire parish registers since the 13th century without anyone looking twice at it. The name appears in English administrative records from approximately 1200 onward, concentrated almost entirely in the northern counties. Yorkshire and Lancashire primarily, the same recruiting grounds that sent contingents of common soldiers and skilled tradesmen south to the ports of embarkation in the 1180s and 90s. The occupational role it names is specific. A palfreyman was the groom responsible for managing palfreys, the lighter, sure-footed riding horses used by knights and commanders for travel, ceremony, and the daily work of a military campaign, as opposed to the destrier, the heavy war horse bred and trained for combat, or the rouncey, the general-purpose animal used for carrying loads. These were different animals, requiring different handling, different feed regimens, different veterinary knowledge. The palfreyman's expertise was narrow and irreplaceable. The logistics of the Third Crusade of 1189 to 1192 demanded the transport, feeding, watering, and medical care of thousands of horses across sea crossings and overland marches, through terrain that killed animals as efficiently as it killed men. The Itinerarium Peregrinorum et Gesta Regis Ricardi, a contemporary chronicle of Richard I's crusade, held in partial manuscript at the British Library, describes in unusual and specific detail the conditions facing the crusading horses during the crossing from Sicily and southern France. Storms in the Bay of Biscay in 1190 destroyed several transport vessels during the initial crossing. The chronicle records the loss not by the names of the men who drowned, but by the number of horses lost from each vessel, a detail that locates, without comment, exactly how the campaign's administrators valued the animals relative to the men who managed them. The palfreymen's charges were cargo as much as creatures. Their survival was a logistical priority entered into the record in the same register as provisions and armaments. The Yorkshire Lay Subsidy of 1297, held at the National Archives in Kew, lists a Thomas palfreyman in the North Riding, assessed at a rate consistent with a skilled tradesman, above the common laborer, below the minor knight. The name is already hereditary by this date, which means the original occupational connection almost certainly traces to the campaigns of the 1180s or 90s, passed from a man who handled horses on crusade to a son who inherited the designation without necessarily inheriting the role. Approximately 1,200 people carry the surname palfreyman in England and Wales today. The distribution is not scattered. It runs in a dense band from Leeds westward toward Preston, directly over the medieval recruiting territory from which northern English crusading contingents were drawn. Palfreyman ranks above Templar in one specific dimension. The Templar entry names institutional membership, a relationship to a structure. Palfreyman names direct individual participation in the physical machinery of a specific campaign. It places a man in the hold of a ship, on a dock in Acre, in a field somewhere between Jaffa and Jerusalem, holding a horse that cost more than he earned in a year. The limitation that keeps it from ranking higher is equally specific. The occupational byname was applied to palfreymen in many contexts beyond crusading, and for most individual bearers of the name, the crusading origin is contextually probable rather than documentarily certain. The detail the chronicle provides, and which most readers of medieval military history overlook, is this. The Itinerarium Peregrinorum specifies that the horses lost in the Bay of Biscay were recorded by type, not merely by number. Palfreys are listed separately from destriers. The administrative distinction that gave the palfreyman his occupational identity was preserved even in the accounting of disaster. The British Library holds the relevant manuscript. The entry for the horse losses sits in a section describing the 1190 crossing in a hand that shows no particular distress, only the careful notation of a clerk whose job was to record what the campaign had consumed. The Yorkshire Lay Subsidy membrane is at Kew. Palfreyman households appear on the current electoral roll in a corridor running between Leeds and Preston that has not moved significantly from where it was 7 centuries ago. The horses are gone, the man who cared for them is gone, the name is still there. Number 4 records a different kind of labor. not physical work done in the field, but transactional work done in the parish, and the transaction at its center was one that the Crusades made both necessary and deeply corrupt. Number 4. The surname pardoner records a man who sold forgiveness. The Crusades were where the market for that particular commodity grew large enough to require a professional class of salesmen. The role expanded across the 12th and 13th centuries in direct response to the theological architecture of crusading indulgences, and the surname appears in English records from the mid-13th century onward, most clearly in the 100 Rolls of 1279, a systematic survey of English landholding and tenure commissioned by Edward I, which records a Henricus le Pardonné in Oxfordshire. The roll itself was older. Pope Urban II's proclamation of the First Crusade at Clermont in 1095 established the foundational principle. Participation in the crusading enterprise earned a plenary indulgence, full remission of the temporal punishment owed for sin. Over the course of successive crusades, this principle was extended. A man who could not go but who contributed financially received a partial indulgence. The logic was coherent within its own theological framework. The distribution of those indulgences required infrastructure, and the pardoner was that infrastructure. An authorized agent of the church, traveling from parish to parish, carrying sealed documents, displaying relics to authenticate his commission, preaching, and exchanging letters of indulgence for coin. The system was regulated repeatedly because it was abused repeatedly. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 restricted pardoner activity across Christendom and required episcopal authorization for any agent distributing indulgences. The council's canons, preserved in multiple manuscript copies at the Vatican Apostolic Archive in Rome, name the pardoner explicitly among the sources of ecclesiastical disorder that the council was convened to address. Regulation did not eliminate the abuse, it documented it, which is its own kind of evidence. The indulgence document itself, the physical parchment or paper a pardoner carried and distributed, was among the most widely produced single-sheet documents in medieval Europe. The Vatican Apostolic Archive holds surviving examples from the crusading period sealed with leaden bullae, the small lead discs impressed with the papal insignia that authenticated the document and prevented copying. The lead is still there, the seal impression is still legible. The crusading fund for which each indulgence was issued is named in the text, in a Latin hand that has not changed its meaning in 8 centuries. The pardoner entry ranks above palfreymen because it names not a logistical role, but the theological mechanism that made the Crusades financially viable and spiritually coherent to the men and women who funded them without going. Palfreyman documents the physical campaign. Pardoner documents the system of belief and obligation that sustained the campaign across generations and across geography. Geoffrey Chaucer, completing the Canterbury Tales in approximately 1400, gave his pardoner a bag of pig's bones passed off as relics, a voice full of scriptural quotation deployed in the service of fraud, and a commission from Rome that is never examined too closely. The portrait is recognizable because the type was recognizable. The crusading indulgence trade had been running for 300 years by the time Chaucer wrote it down. The Ellesmere manuscript of the Canterbury Tales, held at the Huntington Library in San Marino, California, contains the earliest surviving illustrated portrait of the pardoner, a thin man on a pale horse, his credentials hanging at his belt. The 100 Rolls of 1279 are held at the National Archives. The Vatican's Apostolic Archive is in Rome, and its reading rooms are open to qualified researchers. The surname pardoner survives in current English records, though it is among the rarer names on this list, a function perhaps of how comprehensively the role was discredited before the name could propagate widely enough to become common. The lead seals in the Vatican archive are still attached to their documents. No one has thrown them away either. Number 3. The surname Payne looks at first glance like an ordinary English name, the kind that appears on street signs and electoral rolls and school registers without drawing any particular attention. Spelled also pagan, paganel, and paganel, it looks like a religious insult. In the context of the Crusades, it was something more precise and more troubling than that. The name originates in Normandy and crosses into England with the conquest. Paganus appears in Norman records well before 1066 and enters English documentary life from the Domesday Survey of 1086 onward. Its crusading era significance sharpens after 1099, the year Jerusalem fell to the First Crusade, because that is when the word acquired its full theological charge, and when the men who carried it as a given name began to find that it said something about them that they had not chosen to say. Paganus in classical and medieval Latin meant simply a rural dweller, someone from the pagus, the countryside. The theological meaning of pagan derived from this. The countryside was where pre-Christian practice lingered longest, where the old rituals survived in the margins of the new faith. Among the Norman aristocracy of the 11th century, Paganus was also a given name carried without apparent embarrassment by several prominent men. What the Crusades did was sharpen the edge of that meaning in ways its bearers could not entirely control. A man called Paganus in the Crusader states was a man whose Christian allegiance was available to question by his enemies, by the ecclesiastical authorities who watched the conduct of crusading lords, and by the chroniclers who would determine how his behavior was recorded. The name did not accuse, but it left a door open that other names kept shut. The Paganels were a Norman baronial family among the earliest English crusaders. Ralph Paganel accompanied the First Crusade, departing with the Norman contingent in 1096. His descendants held land in Yorkshire for 3 generations, their presence recorded across approximately 40 manors in the county, making the family one of the largest Norman landholding concentrations in the north. The Domesday Survey of 1086 already shows the name distributed across Yorkshire and Lincolnshire in substantial holdings. A chancery enrollment from the 1220s held at the National Archives at Kew records a land grant to a Paganus de Beauchamp, by which date the given name has become a heritable surname, passed across 2 generations since the original crusading enrollments, carrying its ambiguity forward intact into a period when the crusading enterprise itself was already beginning to show the strain of repeated failure. The phonetic reduction that turned Paganus into Pain happened gradually across the 13th and 14th centuries, as Anglo-Norman French continued its compression of Latin-derived syllables into forms that English speakers could absorb without effort. Pain retains no visible trace of the original meaning. It sounds like an English monosyllable, unremarkable, easily overlooked. According to current electoral register analysis, approximately 45,000 people carry the surname Payne in England and Wales today, making it one of the 2,000 most common surnames in the country. None of that frequency signals its origin. The name absorbed into ordinary English and stopped pointing at anything. Pain and pagan rank at number 3 because this entry carries something the earlier entries on this list do not. Not a record of participation, not a record of institutional membership, but a record of doubt. The name does not document crusading, it documents the shadow that fell over crusading allegiance when a man's behavior in the field raised questions his name was already equipped to ask. It is the first entry on this list where the surname functions not as a certificate, but as a question mark pressed into the language and transmitted across 9 centuries. The village of Pagan Hill in Gloucestershire takes its name from a paganal landholding documented in the 13th century. The name of the hill was recorded when the family's connection to it was still within living memory, and the name remained after the family was gone. It is still called Pagan Hill today. The road sign stands at the edge of the village. There is no marker explaining what it means, no heritage. Board connecting the name above the road to the Norman baronial family who rode out of England toward Jerusalem in 1096 and came back with their allegiance attached to a word that the landscape has not yet let go. The Domesday entries for Ralph Paganel are at the National Archives. The Chancery enrollment for Paganus de Beauchamp is catalogued and accessible. 45,000 people carry the name Payne this morning on streets from Cornwall to Northumberland, and the crusading ambiguity inside it has been invisible for 600 years. Number 2 belongs to a man who held no sword and wore no cross. His role in the Crusades left no military record. It was, nonetheless, more essential to the functioning of every crusading campaign than the work of most knights who have entries in the chronicles. Number 2. The surname Latimer names the interpreter, the man without whom no crusading commander could speak to a prisoner, no treaty could be negotiated across a language boundary, and no captured document could be read. The role is documented in crusading-era accounts from the First Crusade onward, and the surname appears in English records from the early 12th century. Latimier derives from the medieval Latin Latinarius, a man who worked in Latin, or more broadly and practically, a man who moved between languages. In the context of the Crusader states, where the military and administrative apparatus of Western European Christendom was attempting to govern territory whose population spoke Arabic, Greek, Armenian, and several other languages, the Latimer was the instrument through which any of that governance became possible. He interrogated prisoners. He translated documents captured in battle. He sat at the table when ransoms were negotiated and rendered each side's position into the other's language. He was the point through which all intelligence passed. Without him, the command structure of a crusading force was, in the most practical sense, deaf. The Latimer family of Braybrook in Northamptonshire held a barony from the 12th century onward. Their name appears in the Liber Feodorum, the Book of Fees, a royal record of feudal landholding compiled between 1198 and 1293, as a baronial house whose original function was administrative and interpretive rather than purely military. The family had crossed from the Crusader states into English-landed society by a route that the documentary record preserves in outline if not in complete detail. Hugh Latimer, the Protestant bishop burned at Oxford in 1555 alongside Nicholas Ridley, bore a surname that by his time had been carried continuously for more than 3 centuries without any connection to its origin being visible to the man himself. The name's crusading identity had been absorbed entirely into English aristocratic and then clerical culture. It named a bishop and a martyr, and never, in those contexts, pointed back to the man in the Crusader states who had sat between 2 commanders and turned one language into another while both sides waited. According to current electoral register data, approximately 4,800 people carry the surname Latimer in England and Wales today. The Bodleian Library in Oxford holds a 13th century Anglo-Norman translation manuscript, a text rendered from Arabic into French by an interpreter working in the Crusader states, the nature of whose labor is described only in a marginal note, identifying the translator by function and not by name. The function was enough, it was always enough. The name is not there, the work is there. The Bodleian catalog entry describes it without ceremony in the same register used for every other acquisition on the same shelf. Latimer ranks at number 2 because it names the most cognitively and strategically essential role in the entire crusading apparatus, the role that made all other roles communicable, that turned military intent into diplomatic exchange and military intelligence into actionable information. It ranks above every entry below it on this list because it documents intellectual labor, which is harder to see in the record and harder to replace in the field than any of the physical work the earlier entries describe. The church at Braybrook in Northamptonshire still stands. The Latimer family monuments are inside it, in stone, with the name carved into the surface in a hand that assumed the name needed no explanation. The Liber Feodorum is at the National Archives. The translation manuscript is in the Bodleian Reading Room, available for consultation, identified by its catalog number, sitting on a shelf in Oxford not far from the building where the man who last bore this name as a famous man was condemned to die. Number 1. Every name on this list contains the Crusades at one remove, in a role performed in their service, an institution built around them, a language produced by contact with them, a question raised by proximity to them. The name at number 1 contains none of that distance. It contains nothing but the act itself. The surname Crusader, with its variants Croise, Croisier, and Cruiser, entered English administrative vocabulary from the First Crusade of 1096 onward and appears in county records from approximately 1140. It derives from the French croisader, itself built on croix, cross, with the agentive suffix that turns a noun into a person defined by that noun. The man was not named for what he did with a sword, he was named for what he wore on his chest, and for what that sign legally committed him to from the moment it was placed there. The crusading vow was a formal, witnessed, sacramental act. A man who took the cross knelt before a priest, swore in the presence of witnesses, and received a cloth cross that was physically attached to his outer garment. From that moment he was a crucis ignatus, one who has been signed with the cross. The designation was not honorific, it was administrative. It changed his legal status in every record that subsequently touched him. Parish rolls, manor accounts, military musters, chancery documents, subsidy returns. His other identities, Carfetenstillend, craftsman, tenant, younger son, neighbor, were not erased, but they were suspended behind this single total designation, which named him more completely than anything else in his community's documentary apparatus could manage. The vow could not be abandoned without papal dispensation. Men who took the cross and did not go were pursued through ecclesiastical courts, their assets potentially subject to forfeiture, their spiritual status compromised in ways that had practical consequences in the world they lived in. Men who went and returned were re-entered into local records with their crusading status noted as past rather than present. And sometimes the by-name did not follow the vow into the past. It stayed. It passed to children who had never crossed the Mediterranean, who had never seen the walls of Acre or the plain before Jerusalem. The name was what the vow left behind when the man who made it was gone. The Archives Nationales in Paris holds a sealed Crusade vow document from 1188. That year is precise and significant. It is the year of the Saladin tithe, the levy by which Henry II of England and Philip II of France together imposed a tax of 1/10 of all income and movable goods on every person in their kingdoms who did not take the cross. The document records the vow of an unnamed man, witnessed by a priest, committed to parchment, and sealed with wax. The seal is intact. The Archives Nationales catalog entry describes it as bien conservé, well preserved. A cross is still legible at the center of the impression. The document is 836 years old. It was never intended to outlast the expedition it enabled. It survived because no one discarded it, because it sat in a collection that was never lost, because the institutions that held it continued to exist through everything that followed. This is what the surname Crusader is, a thing no one threw away. The English surname variants appear across multiple county records between 1150 and 1350. The Curia Regis rolls of 1220 list a Weilhelmus Le Croisier in Hampshire. The Hampshire lay subsidy of 1327 lists a Thomas Crusader in the same county. A span of over a century in a single geographic location, which suggests either continuous family transmission across 4 or 5 generations, or repeated independent application of the designation to men in the same community whose crusading status was locally known and administratively recorded. Both possibilities are significant. The first means a family carried the name from a specific vow, made in a specific year, all the way into a world where the crusading enterprise itself was in terminal decline. The second means the designation was still being assigned as a primary identifier into the 14th century, still the most important thing a clerk could say about a man. According to current electoral register analysis, fewer than 50 households in England and Wales carry any variant of this surname today. Crusader, Croisier, Cruiser, fewer than 50 families. It is the rarest name on this list and the most direct. Historians of medieval onomastics working within the English Surname Survey at the University of Leicester identify the Crucis Signatus designation as the single most precisely documented of all crusading era bynames, for a reason that the other entries on this list make legible by contrast. Every other name describes proximity to the Crusades, a function performed in their orbit, a cultural mark they left on the language. This name describes only the moment of enrollment, the instant the vow was made and the cross was placed on the cloth, the point at which a man became, in every administrative sense, nothing but a crusader. Every other entry on this list ranks below it for the same reason. Pilgrim was a broader category. Crusoe was a phonetic ghost of the word. Saracen named the encounter rather than the enlistment. Crossman translated the designation into English but could not entirely contain it. Templar named an institution's workers and outlasted the institution itself. Palfreyman named a logistical role that extended beyond crusading. Pardoner named the financial mechanism that sustained it. Payne and Pagan named the shadow that fell over a family's allegiance. Latimer named the intellectual labor that made command possible. Each of those names contains the Crusades. This name is the Crusades, compressed into a single designation that was assigned on a specific afternoon in front of a specific priest to a man whose other name we do not know and never retrieved. The Archives Nationales is on the Rue des Quatre Filles in Paris, in the Marais district, in a building that has held documents since the French Revolution organized them there. The wax seal sits in the dark of the archive's climate-controlled storage, legible, intact, the cross at its center no longer pointing toward anything except the fact of its own survival. The Curia Regis rolls are at the National Archives in Kew, available by appointment. The Hampshire Lay Subsidy membrane is catalogued and accessible, and fewer than 50 families in England carry the name this morning. On streets that do not know what the name means, in households that did not choose it, holding a word that a kneeling man pressed into the record in 1188, and that has never fully stopped being carried. 10 names, 10 different angles of approach to the same institution, the same centuries, the same movement of human beings across the known world toward a city most of them never reached. The Crusades left their evidence not only in ruined walls and exhausted chronicles, but in the surnames still carried by people who have no idea what they are holding. In the parish registers, the poll tax membranes, the chancery enrollments, and the electoral rolls that connect 1188 to this morning without a gap. Origins Archive finds histories like these. Subscribe to Origins Archive for more.